I think it'll be fun to talk math with math students. I'm just really psyched about that. So I am Leemon Baird. He asked me to say a few things about what I've done. So I was a professor. I have started companies. And the latest one is Hedera, which does a blockchain, a DLT, called Hashgraph, the Hedera Hashgraph. So that's the name of the company, is Hedera Hashgraph. I've done that. I've been a professor. I've been a researcher for a long time. Did a lot of stuff in machine learning. That's what my PhD was in, was deep neural networks for reinforcement learning, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Although back then, 20 years ago, we called them convolutional neural networks. We didn't call them deep neural networks. That was machine learning. I've done a lot in that. And then I've done other things, too, that still have some interesting open questions in math. So I did a lot on jam resistance. Have radios talk to each other? Use a coding theory that allows them to be hard to jam without having a secret. All the known forms of jam resistance require the sender and receiver to have some secret in common, a key. And this does it without any key at all. And it's still just as jam resistant. This is still the only algorithm that can do that, and the BBC algorithm. And so that was an interesting project. And then I also have a PhD student currently working on an extension of that, the universal algorithm. So we now have 1.5 algorithms that know how to do that. We've published some things on it, but it's not really practical yet for that second one. So interesting math questions that come out of this. There is a tree coloring question. If you have a complete binary tree, can you find a way to color it so that it is colorful? Colorful means if you ever look at a small subtree rooted at the root, it has to have lots of colors in it. It should be impossible to find a little subtree that only has one color or only has a few colors. They need to have a lot. That's the question. Can you completely color a gigantic binary tree, complete binary tree, so that all the little subtrees coming down from the root each have lots of colors in them? And there's a fun theorem that I was able to prove that if you just do your coloring randomly, it will have this property. So almost all tree colorings have this property. But guess what? I don't know a single one. Almost all tree colorings have this property. I don't know of a single tree coloring that has this property. This is like the early days of graph theory when we knew that a random graph is an expander graph with overwhelmingly high probability. And for many years, no one knew of any expander graphs. We just knew that almost all graphs are this thing, but we didn't know of a single one. So it's not finding a needle in a haystack. It's trying to find hay in a haystack. An amazingly hard problem. So that's a fun open problem. Another interesting open problem is the generalization. It comes from the field of monotone Boolean functions. Imagine a circuit made out of AND gates and OR gates. No NOT gates, just ANDs and ORs. That's a monotone function. You could look at the inputs that make the output be true. You could look at minimal inputs, a pattern of inputs where you have as few truths as possible coming in to get the output. And an obvious question is, well, how many different input patterns are there that are minimal input patterns that will make this true? There's no theory right now on how to look at a circuit and guess how many inputs there will be, how many input patterns there will be that are minimal. And there's no way to guess how many truths will be true. I mean, how many inputs will be true in those. And so now we have a theory for that has several hypotheses, and we need to prove those or disprove them. So that's an interesting set of open questions coming out of that theory. And then I've done a bunch in Sailor automata. Sailor automata are sort of fake universes. You make up the laws of physics for this fake universe any way you want, and then you could ask a question. Does it have something like conservation of energy in our universe, or conservation of momentum, or conservation of angular momentum? Are there any conservation laws in this fake universe we just made up? There's a huge literature on this, and we've published a number of papers on how to do that and had new results, but no one has ever found good ways to disprove it. Given the universe, I want to prove there are no conserved functions, no non-trivial ones. And we have some hypotheses along those lines that are open questions right now. So this is just past life stuff that are interesting math questions that I ponder from time to time, and I think are kind of fun problems to work on. In a completely different field of math, you could talk about gossip protocols. How can computers talk over the internet to each other and spread information really fast by just calling each other at random? That's what gossip means. They just call each other at random and pass the information. How can we make a protocol that is as fast as possible and as resilient as possible? Like if some of the computers are determined to hurt us, or if a bad guy has some control over the internet and is determined to hurt us, how can we be resilient? Gossip in general is the most resilient and fastest way that we know in computer science of spreading out messages. But there's interesting theory around it. There's actually Byzantine theory for that, which we are not talking about today. But that's a really interesting set of open questions. And then there's Hashgraph. This is an asynchronous Byzantine fault-tolerant agreement protocol. This is an algorithm for how a bunch of computers can agree on something. And there's a huge theory on that going back 3 decades that's just fascinating. And today we're going to go through that. Today I'm going to talk about the theory of what does Byzantine stuff mean. And there's really interesting math behind it. I think it's kind of fun, and perhaps you'll enjoy that. The only problem with the standard solution is that it's very slow. And so then I'll show you Hashgraph, which achieves everything of the standard solution but does it very fast. And it does it very simply. We will do a voting algorithm with no voting. That's how you do it. So if you want to be fast, you need to do voting without any voting. So that will be the Hashgraph algorithm. So that's what I have for today. Any questions about all that? Okay. We'll see in a moment if you mind me asking you questions. And if you do, then don't say anything. But if you don't mind, then we'll have a fun conversation. Okay. So, what is blockchain? Blockchain is also called distributed ledger technology. Some people use the word blockchain as a synonym for DLT, but some people use the word blockchain to talk about one particular kind of DLT, one that involves a chain of blocks. Go figure. So when you say blockchain, if you mean a chain of blocks, then there are DLTs that are not a blockchain, like Hashgraph is a DLT that's not a blockchain. And so I just use the term DLT in general, distributed ledger technology. The idea is that we all have a bunch of computers remembering some information. It's a ledger, and it is distributed, lots of different computers run by different people. And we want to trust it even if some of those people are bad. That's the whole point. So that's what a DLT is. So we want multiple computers to reach agreement on the ordering of transactions. You imagine people around the world sending in transactions, and these computers agree on what order to put them in. That's the main thing they're doing. They may also agree on a timestamp for each one, but that's basically all they're doing. And then once they've put them in order, they process them in that order. So we want it to be resilient, though, to having some of the computers being malicious. They can lie, they can just be turned off, they could do anything disruptive they can think of, and the internet itself might be disruptive. Maybe the Great Firewall of China is around some section of our network, and it lets some packets through and not others. And it delays some and not others, and it deletes some and not others. Or maybe somebody manages to hack into the router outside of the university or the college here, and they can filter the packets going through it in malicious ways. So we have to assume that the internet is being attacked. Plus, the internet could just have botnet attacks, where somebody floods one computer with lots of packets and shuts it down. So the bad guys can shut down computers arbitrarily. The bad guys can do things bad to the internet communication fabric itself, and some of the computers are bad. That's what we want to be able to survive. We want to have trust, even if you don't trust any particular component. You just trust that most of the components are good. So an example of this might be a cryptocurrency. Every blockchain has a cryptocurrency, and most blockchains do more than that. So a DLT is going to have a cryptocurrency, and all that is each of the computers will remember how many coins you have, and how many you have, and how many you have. They remember all these account balances, and that's it. When we put the transactions in order, if one of the transactions says, I would like to pay some H-bars to this store, an H-bar is a coin in this system, I want to pay this store some H-bars and have them give me a product. Then everybody deducts that much from my account, adds that much to the store's account, and we're done. All the computers do that. If I only have one coin in my account, one H-bar, and I try to pay this store one H-bar and try to pay this store one H-bar and buy 2 different products with one coin, then what all the computers do is agree on an order. Which of those 2 was first? And once they've agreed, the first store actually gets the coin. And the second store is told, sorry, that transaction failed. And that way I can't double spend. I can't buy 2 products with one coin. Make sense? Okay, that's what a DLT is. Of course, the devil in the details is all about how do we reach agreement, given all these horrific attacks that can happen to it. I mean, we're making all sorts of assumptions that the attacker has lots of power. The story that everybody goes back to is the Byzantine Generals Problem. So in the ancient city of Byzantium, there were a number of generals that were supposed to prosecute a war against some foreign city, and they were on different sides of the city, and they have to decide, do we want to attack tomorrow morning at dawn? I guess you usually attack at dawn. Back in the old days, you don't attack at night. And so they all had to decide this. Now, here's the problem. There's no telephones, there's no radio back then. So they can only talk to each other by sending messengers. And they're far apart. And the problem with messengers is a messenger might get lost. A messenger might get captured. A messenger might get bribed to just not give your message or to give it late. You never know what's going to happen with that. So messages can be delayed or lost. Furthermore, we have all these generals running different parts of the army. Some of those generals may be traitors. They want to disrupt us. So we have to come to some kind of an agreement on whether to attack or not, where some of us are lying, some of us are going to break whatever our protocol is, and some of our messages are going to be delayed or lost. But we still want to reach agreement. Why? Because if we all attack, we're going to win. And if none of us attack, well, okay, we're still fine. But if only a few of us attack, we'll be overwhelmed and we'll all die. All the ones that attacked. So we want to really avoid not being in agreement. We definitely want to come to agreement. That's the Byzantine Generals Problem. This is the story that we always tell. And that's it. Questions on that? Does that make sense? Okay. So, I did say that messages can be delayed or lost. I'm going to keep coming back to this. Asynchronous means we can have arbitrary delays, but synchronous or partially synchronous means we put assumptions, like the attackers can only slow down my messenger by a certain amount. That's actually a very strong assumption. It's like assuming any message I send between two honest people on the internet will always get there within 10 seconds, and will always get there. Well, that's not a very good assumption. What if there's a botnet attacking me and flooding me with packets? I may never get the message. Or they may keep resending it for an hour until the attack ends, and then I'll get the message. There may not be any bound on how long the message is delayed. So it's not a very good assumption for the real-world internet. But some BFT systems make this assumption.
Sorry, do we assume as well that this message can be altered? Or do we just assume a loss and delay?
Great question. I'm going to assume digital signatures, it cannot be altered. Okay. If you could do arbitrary alterations, then this is clearly an impossible problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, there are two different assumptions people make. Some people assume that when I send a messenger to you, you know for sure that it's not altered, but you can't prove it to someone else. I'm not going to make that weaker assumption. I'll make the stronger assumption. If I digitally sign it, you know that it came from me, and you can show it to someone else, and they'll know it came from me. Okay. I see no reason to deal with the weaker one, because if we have digital signatures at all, why not treat them like digital signatures? But those are the two flavors everyone does. Everyone does have to assume the messages aren't altered, because otherwise the problem's obviously unsolvable, because no one can talk to anyone. And so you have no hope at all.
Is there any reason behind the exact value of the one-third constant?
Ooh, good question, yes. So, spoiler alert, there is a theorem that says you can never do better than 1/3. This is the best you could do. There are algorithms that only work up to 1/5 being bad, or other numbers. But the best algorithms go up to 1/3, and there's a theorem that says there's nothing better than that. So I'm just going to say 1/3 through all here, and 2/3 through all here. And the theorem that 1/3 is the best you can do is actually really easy to show. I took out that slide. Tell you what, if you're interested afterwards, I'll go to the whiteboard over there and draw it on the board. It's no equations, it's just pictures. I can draw you the pictures in 2 minutes, and you'll see why. Actually, I can just tell you anyway. But you can never do better than 1/3. Okay, so this is the Byzantine Generals Problem. So let's try to make a clearly defined mathematical description of what the problem is we're trying to solve. We could say that we are going to start with a single yes-no question. So we all know the yes-no question. We each have an initial vote. Initially, I think we should attack, you think we shouldn't. We all have an initial vote on this yes-no question. We want to guarantee that any honest person will eventually decide. Decide means that you decide, we have reached an agreement on yes, and you'll never change your mind. Or we have reached an agreement on no, and you'll never change your mind. That's what it means to decide. We'll have protocols where you can change your vote over time. But once you decide, you never change your vote. Or to put it another way, we don't just reach agreement, we know when we've reached agreement. There are algorithms where you can prove, well, eventually we'll all come to the same answer and stop changing our answers, but nobody will ever know when we've reached that state. That's not very helpful. So for BFT, we require that not only do we reach the answer, we know when we reach the answer. I know at a moment in time, yes, the conclusion really is a yes, and I know for sure that all the other honest people will eventually come to a yes. There has to be a moment in time when I know that. And we also want to say, well, all the honest members need to decide eventually, and that's what agreement means. That's what we want to be able to prove, is that everybody eventually decides, and that, of course, we all decide the same way. That's what agreement means. We all come to the same conclusion. So there is a mathematical definition of Byzantine fault tolerant. And we'll make assumptions. We're going to assume less than a third are malicious and can lie and violate the protocol. If you get shut down, you're a fault, I'll call that malicious as well. If you just turn off your computer, that's malicious. Or if somebody else shuts you down, they have forced you to be malicious. We'll assume that. Also, the messages can be arbitrarily delayed if it's asynchronous. I like asynchronous. We'll hope to get asynchronous in this. Is this a good mathematical description of the problem given the story I gave? Or is there a flaw? Could we come up with an algorithm that satisfies this that really doesn't satisfy the spirit of the problem we're trying to solve?
Ideally, we want time bounds.
Ideally, we would like time bounds. Now, here we have a trade-off. If we're going to do asynchronous, then the attacker is allowed to delay all messages by 1,000,000 years, so I can't really put a time bound. So what I usually do is I say, first we'll prove asynchronous, which of course means no time bounds, and then I'll say something like, but in the case that we do have pretty fast messages on average, I'd like to reach consensus fast on average. And we'll actually talk about that later. So I like that. That's a really good thing to look at. Here is an algorithm that technically satisfies that. Hey, the algorithm is we all decide yes. Doesn't matter what our votes are, doesn't matter what people told me, doesn't matter anything, we all decide yes. This is a really fast algorithm. It even works when the internet doesn't exist. Great. The only problem is you can't really call this an agreement algorithm because it's trivial. So what we're going to do is add one more math constraint to our problem description. The decision has to match an initial vote. That's a pretty weak constraint. If we initially had one yes and everybody else voting no, it's okay if we end up deciding yes. We'll allow that. It doesn't have to be fair, it doesn't have to be the majority. Actually, Hashgraph has some fairness, which is a different set of theorems, and we've written a proof and had a computer check the proof of fairness, which is an entirely separate thing. But today, we don't care about fairness. But we do have to have at least one person vote yes if we're going to decide as a group on a yes. That's just to stop the trivial algorithm. Make sense? Okay. Also, it's kind of cool. We've worded that last sentence so that we can later generalize to more than just a yes-no question. We could have a whole bunch of different possible decisions, and we're all voting on one of them. And we just say, well, we have to all agree on one of what we initially thought of. So maybe we have to pick an integer from 1 to a trillion. There's only 10 of us. The rule is that we have to start with one of the 10 numbers that we had voted for. I mean, we have to end up concluding that. Okay. So, in basic English, Byzantine means you will reach consensus. You know when you reach consensus. You're never wrong. The assumptions are the attacker controls less than a third of the members, the computers. They control the network itself. And we are asynchronous, which means arbitrary delays. That's what it means. So, how can we do this? How can we... Okay, we're doing pretty well on time, I think. How can we do this? Well, here's the simple answer. We'll do a voting algorithm. We'll pick one of us, say Alice. We always use Alice, Bob, Carol, Dave in cryptography for some reason. There is a historical reason for that. It comes from a movie. So, Alice is going to collect votes from everybody. Everybody emails their vote to Alice, and then she sees what the majority is, and we'll say that a tie vote is a yes, so we have an answer. She'll send the answer to everybody, and that's what we agree on. Done. Perfect. Any problems with that voting protocol?
What if Alice is malicious?
What if Alice is malicious? That's terrible. She could do all sorts of things, like turn off her computer, we never reach agreement. Or she could tell you that we agreed on yes and tell me that we agreed on no. So, the proposal was a majority vote, where Alice collects the votes and sends out the results. It's pretty efficient. Each of us only has to send one message, except for Alice. She has to send in messages. But it has this problem. What if her computer just dies? Or what if she is malicious and she sends out different answers? That's a problem. Okay, well, let's make a better solution. Here's the solution. Each of us sends our vote to everyone else. A lot more votes going out. And so you don't have to take Alice's word for it how I voted. Everybody hears how I vote because I send it out to everybody. So each of us collects the votes from everybody else. Now it's no longer order 1, it's order n. We're now sending out much more messages per person. We're all as slow as Alice now, but there's no special Alice. Yay! Does it work? Any problems? Have we solved it? Probably not. So here's a problem. What if Alice, when she sends out her vote, says, hey, I vote yes to you guys, but tells you guys, hey, I vote no? Then when you count up your votes, maybe her yes was just enough to push it over, and you think, oh, we all have a majority yes. But you guys think we have a majority no. Now we have conflicting consensuses. How could we solve that? No ideas. Well, what we will do... Are you about to say something? No.
Well, I can't. Well, you said that again.
I'm sorry?
Everyone can send theirs again.
So Alice sends out twice to everybody. But she could lie twice. So that doesn't work. But I like your idea of sending...
No, I don't mean send what they believe the majority.
I like that. Now, of course, if all you do is have half of us say, I think the majority is yes, and half say, I think the majority is no, then maybe we know there's a problem, but maybe we don't know what the problem is. And maybe that's not good. But I like this idea of resending.
Can you have Alice only sending it to one person, and then one person sends theirs and Alice's, and you keep going around, and that way no one can lie or send different answers to different people?
Because we have digital signatures. That works nicely. Ooh, I like that. So we could talk about that. We could talk about sending... Actually, we could do it in a parallel way, where everyone sends their votes to everyone, and then everyone sends a receipt for each received vote to everyone else. So we could do some kind of a thing like that. And that's pretty good. So now Alice could send out different votes to different people, and maybe we would eventually all find out about her duplicity, or maybe we wouldn't. Possibly we wouldn't. It could be that she sends out different votes to different people, and they don't perhaps send to each other. So that's a problem, but we even have a bigger problem, because probably with digital signatures, what you just said really can be made to work in a pretty fundamental way. Except, what if Alice just turns off her computer? She sends nothing to anybody. And all of us are waiting to get her vote before we count the election. Or even if she does vote, what if she doesn't send Bob doesn't send the receipt from Alice? Bob doesn't tell us all how Alice voted. So I really like this idea that you guys have come up with. What we're going to do is Bob is going to tell everyone what Alice told him. And Carol is going to tell everyone Alice what told her. It's in squared messages now. We're kind of blowing up. But everybody tells everybody what everybody said. But we still have a problem if some people just turn off their computers and don't vote. We can't wait until everybody has voted, because remember, almost a third of us are malicious. So someone who's malicious can just turn off their computer for eternity. So we're getting closer. No. Okay? So, let's do this. Let's say I am going to count Alice as having voted yes if I get receipts from more than 2/3 of you. More than 2/3 of you say, hey, Alice told me a yes. As long as I get receipts from more than 2/3 of you with a yes, then I will count Alice as officially voting yes. And if I get more than 2/3 of you saying that she voted no, I will count Alice as officially voting no. And I'll just keep waiting and receiving receipts until I have, I could do it until I have votes from more than 2/3 of the population or something. But for right now, I'm never going to say that. I'm just going to say, I'm going to do an election in my head where I only count Alice's vote if I get from more than 2/3 of you. Same amount of bandwidth, but now we have a theorem. The theorem is, if less than a third of us are dishonest, no matter what happens with the internet, if you decide to count Alice as a yes, and I decide to count Alice, guaranteed I'll also count Alice as a yes. There's no way that you could count her as a yes and I could count her as a no. You might see some votes from Alice saying yes. You might see some receipts about Alice saying yes. And I might see some receipts about Alice saying yes. But we won't, saying no. But we won't both reach that threshold of more than 2/3. Does anybody see a proof of that theorem? Here it is. It's a simple counting argument. Can Bob and Carol both end up counting Alice 2 different ways? Well, Bob must have received yes receipts about Alice from more than 2/3 of the population. More than 2/3 of us told Bob, yes, Alice voted yes. And more than 2/3 of us must have told Carol, no, Alice voted no. That's the only way that Carol and Bob could both have counted this vote, but counted it opposite ways. The only way they could violate the theorem is if we had more than 2/3 of us saying that Alice voted yes, and more than 2/3 of us saying that Alice voted no. But if that's the case, a simple counting argument says, well, if I have more than 2/3 and more than 2/3, the overlap of the two must be more than 1/3. If you think about it, that's kind of obvious. Imagine a box of width 1, more than 2/3 and more than 2/3, the overlap is more than 1/3. Wait, the overlap is more than 1/3, but we said less than 1/3 of us are dishonest. So that means there must have been an honest person that lied. The honest person would not tell you that Alice voted yes and tell you that Alice voted no. That honest person would only have taken whatever the first vote was they got from Alice, and they would tell everybody that vote, and they would not lie. So as long as less than 1/3 of us are dishonest, guaranteed, any vote you count and any vote I count will match. Cool. Are we done? Well, no. Maybe we don't actually get any votes that count. So the problem is, what if different people, and even if we get even if we get some votes that count, maybe you only get a few votes that count, and you only get a few votes that count. And the votes that you get that count and the votes that you get that count have different majorities. So you get a majority of yes, you get a majority of no, and we still have a false consensus. So this hasn't fixed our problem, but this theorem is maybe a useful building block. In fact, it's the core building block. In some sense, this was the hard part. The idea of having receipts and waiting for 2/3 to count a receipt is sort of the key building block. And in Hashgraph, it's slightly different, but it is the strongly seen lemma, and it's the building block of everything else. Everything else sort of follows easily from this. So how does that work? Here's how it works. Here's the proposal. We're going to have multiple rounds of voting. So initially, we all had our initial vote of yes or no, and we send that vote out to everybody, then we send everybody a receipt on that vote. Everybody keeps collecting until you get receipts, enough receipts that you know that you can actually count votes from more than 2/3 of the population. So more than 2/3 of the population each has more than 2/3 of the population giving me a receipt. At that point, I end the round. I say, okay, I've collected enough votes. And then I just change my vote to match the majority of what I collected. And we do that every round. If there is ever a round where I actually counted yes votes from more than 2/3 of the population, then I decide. And if I collected no votes from more than 2/3 of the population, I decide. As soon as I collect votes from more than 2/3, remember collecting is you have to have these lots of receipts, then I decide. So I'll just keep doing rounds until I finally can decide, and then I'm done. I'll keep playing the game, but I'll keep playing it, but I always vote the same way. Whatever that last majority was, that's what I keep voting forever. Is it possible we'll come to different consensuses? Is it possible that some of us will come to consensus and some won't? No. Beautiful theorem. The theorem is, if somebody decides, then everybody else will decide the exact same way within one round. Is that obvious? Maybe not. So let's talk about it. I view this as the core theorem of all of Byzantine theory, and half the papers in the literature, most of them don't even mention it, and those that do mention it in passing or it's brought into some other lemma. But it's really the key to understanding Byzantine agreement. When you collect votes, remember collecting means I have enough receipts that I'm really sure about it. When you collect votes, you don't end the round until you've collected votes from more than 2/3 of the population. At that point, you could be in one of 4 categories. You could see all of them are yeses, or a supermajority is yeses. More than 2/3 of the whole population is yeses. So maybe I only counted more than 2/3 votes, and every single one was a yes. That's a supermajority yes. Or I could have a supermajority no, or I'm in the between, where I don't have a supermajority. So then I just either have a majority of what I collected as yes or a majority of what I collected as no. 4 categories. Either I had this big super majority of yeses or nos, or I just have, a simple majority of yeses or nos of just what I collected. And we'll just say if it's a tie equals, if it's a tie, we'll call that a yes. Ties don't really matter. We just want to come to agreement. So who cares what we do in ties? So we'll make it a yes. If we have these 4 categories, the theorem is everybody is going to fall into 2 categories that are adjacent to each other. That's kind of cool. We will not have the case that some of us are in the top category, some are in the next one, some are in the next one, some are in the next one. We'll never spread out across all 4. In any given round, we'll all be in 2 adjacent categories. So, how do you prove that theorem? That picture looks a lot like the picture we just saw. If Bob collected votes from more than 2/3 of the population, and Carol collected yes votes from more than 2/3 of the population, their overlap must be more than 1/3. But that more than 1/3 is the majority of what Bob collected. So if Carol is in the top category, Bob must be in the category right next to it, or in the top one with her. One of those 2. So if there's even a single one of us that's like Carol, all the rest of us are like Bob. We're either going to be in this category or the top. 2 adjacent categories. By symmetry, the same as here. If Carol was a supermajority no, all of us will either be there or right next to it. Those 2 like that. And the only way that we could be split across these 2 is if nobody had a supermajority. So we will always be these 2, or these 2. We'll be in adjacent categories. That's it. That's the theorem. What I love about Byzantine stuff is each theorem is really simple. You can say it in English with hand waving on a few pictures. So, we can afford to decide in the top and bottom case. And in the middle 2 cases, you just change your vote to match the majority you collected, and in the next round, you vote that way. And that means that if one person decides yes, everybody else is at least in this category. So of those who haven't decided yet, it's at least a unanimous vote of yes. And in the next round, everybody will collect nothing but yes votes because it's unanimous. And so everybody will decide on the next round. So if any of us ever decides, everybody decides one round later.
Is it possible for us to get stuck kind of in the...
Problem. You are smart. What if we get stuck? What if we go through a round where no one decides, and then another round where no one decides, and then another round where no one decides? Forever. Could happen. That's bad. Now, honestly, it will not happen if the honest people can talk to each other randomly. But if the attacker has infinite power over the internet to delay messages, and the attacker magically knows what's inside of every message, we kind of have to assume there's no encryption here. If the attacker is that powerful, they could actually force us to continue having ties forever. Not exactly ties, but everybody's in the middle. Nobody ever gets a supermajority. It turns out to be really hard. The attacker has to have an incredible amount of control of the internet. But with that much control, they could prevent us from ever reaching consensus. That's a problem. Here's a solution. Now, if the attacker doesn't control the internet, we're going to decide in 2 rounds or 3 rounds almost always. I mean, really, it's exponentially fast how fast we decide. But every 10th round, we'll probably never actually have 10 rounds in real life, but every 10th round, let's have a coin round. Here's the coin round. What we say is that if you haven't decided yet, you just flip a coin and you can change your vote to this random value. This is what a coin round is. And on a coin round, if you get a supermajority, if you got a supermajority the previous round, you don't decide, you just keep that for the next round. So if you collect a supermajority, you just keep the same vote, but otherwise you change your vote. Instead of changing it to the majority of what you collected, you change it to a coin flip. Turns out that if we're in this limbo where we're never reaching consensus, on the coin round, everybody that's honest at least gets a totally random coin flip. And if we all flip heads, we will now have a supermajority of us voting one way, and in 2 rounds we'll all have decided. So, if we all flip heads, we will reach consensus in a couple rounds. So that was the theorem. We will decide with probability 1. So that's where we are then. We can now have a guaranteed decision with probability 1. And you know, probability 1 is because we're flipping coins. Theoretically, we could all flip half heads and half tails for eternity. There's a probability 0 of that happening, but it's not impossible. So of course, we could never prove this guaranteed. The best you could do is probability 1, and probability 1 is good enough. Could we maybe get an algorithm that doesn't use randomness? So it'd be guaranteed and we wouldn't have to do probability 1? No, there's the FLP theorem. The FLP theorem says that consensus is basically impossible, even with one bad node, if you don't have randomness. So we have to use randomness. You'll often hear people misquote the FLP theorem. They'll say, oh, it proves consensus is impossible. No, it proves consensus is impossible if you don't use randomness. So use randomness. And given that you're using randomness, the best you could hope for is with probability 1, and so you get with probability 1. Yay, we're good. Now, still a question. Your question was valid. Could it take 1,000,000 years? Yes, it could take 1,000,000 years, because we've assumed the attacker can turn off the internet for 1,000,000 years. Slightly different question. Could it take 1,000,000 rounds? With coin rounds, as I've described, it could take 1,000,000 rounds, because it's exponentially unlikely we all flip heads. So there is a solution to that. It's called a shared coin. This is a cryptographic primitive. We all talk to each other and do this weird cryptographic stuff, and in the end, we all come up with a head or tail, which almost solves the whole problem for us just right there, except it doesn't guarantee that the head or tail matches our initial votes. So it couldn't actually be an entire Byzantine algorithm by itself. But you could plug it in here as our coins, and it does solve it. And so then what it says is that if we ever need a coin round, after our 10th round, we do a coin round, we're guaranteed to all flip the same way if we're honest, and then within 2 rounds we can converge. And so you can say that we now have a guarantee of a constant number of rounds to convergence with coin rounds, with shared coin rounds. Cool. So we can do shared coins, and that fixes the problem. Actually, it's not a problem, though. It's not really a problem. I don't really care if it takes 1,000,000 rounds or 1 round. I care if it takes 1,000,000 years or 1 second. I care about time, not rounds. And the coin round only fixes the number of rounds problem. The shared coin only fixes the number of rounds problem. It doesn't fix the time problem because we're assuming the attacker can turn off the internet for 1,000,000 years anytime they want to. So we haven't actually accomplished anything by adding shared coins. Yes, we can reduce the number of rounds, but the rounds can still be arbitrarily long, so what have we accomplished? So people do write lots of papers about coin rounds. I find the cryptography of it fascinating and very interesting, but I don't think it has any practical value. I think you're just as well off using a normal coin, especially since a normal coin will converge in a couple rounds anyway. It converges exponentially fast. Actually, it's slightly better than exponential. If you have good communication between the honest people. That only a few honest people are being shut down, only a few are being affected by firewalls. You're going to basically reach consensus instantly anyway. Why worry about this cryptographic primitive? So the shared coin really doesn't help you, so why worry about it? If the rounds can be infinitely long, or arbitrarily long, who cares about shared coins? Okay, so the Byzantine protocol we've come up with works. I have now shared with you a summary of the last 30 years of work. In the last 30 years, most of the work has been on this little minor problem. If I have k rounds and we have this n squared messages per round, that's a lot per person, which is n cubed if you count the total usage of the internet. Let's talk about per person, though. N squared messages per person per round for k rounds, that's a lot of messages going over the internet. And people have tried to reduce this. Well, maybe instead of kn squared, we can make it n squared by doing shared coins. And maybe the n squared could become an n to the 1 or an n to the 1.1 or 1.5 or something by trying to combine votes. Those are different things people have been fighting with for 30 years. The Hashgraph algorithm is not order kn squared. It is order 0 for the consensus. And you could say order 1 for the initial sending out the transactions. If the yes, no is about a transaction, it's order 1. If we're going to vote on the ordering of transactions, you do have to send out each transaction to everyone. So on average, I have to receive each transaction once and send out each transaction once. So I have to do order 1 communication per transaction. But beyond that, to get consensus, will be order 0. Because we're going to do this voting algorithm that we just talked about, but with no votes. Okay? Would you like to see that? Okay. Before we do that, were there any questions on all this Byzantine stuff?
If I were an attacker and I eventually forced you to make a decision based on just flipping a coin, wouldn't I be quite happy with what I'd done?
So, if I have spent my coin at Alice's store and Bob's store,
Yeah.
I was a bad person anyway to have done so. What the community really needs to do is decide on which of those two happened first. The community honestly doesn't care which one we choose.
Okay.
And that's the answer.
Okay.
Now, you could ask, what about fairness? And with fairness, maybe we wouldn't have good fairness. Maybe there are cases like a stock market where we actually care which transaction came first.
Yeah.
And that requires a whole separate set of theorems, which we have proved, and we had a computer check the proof with COQ, and written up a paper on that, but that is not something I'm going to talk about today. But fairness is actually an important thing and has fascinating math behind it. And this is new in the literature. There's been very little written about fairness, starting with, well, how do you mathematically define what fairness even is? Which is actually the biggest part of the question. And so we have a long paper. We spend half the paper defending, well, this is what I think is the most rational definition of fairness. And then we say, and we have it. Here's the proof. Maybe the first half's more important than the second half in a lot of ways. Have you noticed that in math? Really, asking the right question, defining the right problem is the fun part and is maybe 90% of what's important. Then it's nice to solve problems too. Other questions? Okay, so let me show you how to vote without voting, if that's of interest. What we're going to do, order 1. This is order 1 just to get your messages out, and order 0 for the consensus part of it. And order kn squared is much slower than order 1, oddly enough. Not sure how big O works, but I'm pretty sure big O makes 1 be less than kn squared. In the Hashgraph, we are ABFT, not just BFT, but ABFT. So we allow messages to be delayed arbitrarily long and deleted by bad guys, but eventually they get through. And we do have fairness of timestamps, ordering, and access. I will not talk about fairness today. I will a little bit. Here's how it works. First of all, we have glossed over when we say how everybody talks to everybody, how that even works. We'll use a gossip protocol. It's a really simple and fast way of doing it. All it is when I want to get a message out, I just pick someone at random. Alice has a message there. She sends it to Dave. She just picked him at random and sends it to him. Now 2 people know it. Then Alice and Dave each pick someone at random. Now 4 people know it. Then they each pick someone at random. Now 8 people know it. It explodes outward exponentially fast, and very quickly everybody has it. What if one of the computers is shut down? Well, we don't care. Alice tries them, and then she tries someone else. What if somebody partitioned off a quarter of our network that can't talk to the rest? Well, we don't care. It exponentially fast spreads through the 3 quarters that are connected. What if some partitioned off a third of our network? Then we freeze and we wait because our protocol requires more than 2/3 over and over again. And you can't do better. But for anything less than that, gossip is as resilient as you can imagine. Gossip is as good as you can imagine. Gossip has lots of open questions. How do you make gossip even better? There's actually a whole field of Byzantine gossip, which has nothing to do with all the stuff I just talked about. If any of you are interested in working on open problems, gossip has lots of really interesting open problems. But to a first approximation, you do the trivial, most brain-dead thing you can think of, and it works beautifully.
How do people know when to stop gossiping?
So what we're going to do, the answer is, well, you never know when to stop gossiping in this picture. If, however, we have a stream of messages we want to send out, then the answer is, well, the stream keeps coming in forever, so we just keep gossiping forever. And every time I gossip with you, I very quickly figure out, what is it that I know that you don't know, and vice versa. And then I only send you the new messages that you don't yet have. And so then the answer is, well, this red message stops gossiping as soon as everyone has it. But the gossip itself continues. It's just every time I call you and find out what you need, I know that you don't need the red message. Good question. And of course, in any real ledger, we don't just have one transaction. We want transactions coming in forever. So these are all repeated protocols. In fact, the reason we can get away with no voting is because it's a repeated protocol. Each little message I send out will end up counting as an infinite number of votes, potentially. There's arbitrarily many votes without having arbitrarily many bits in it. Single set of bits can count as arbitrary virtual votes. Okay, that's how the red one goes out. Now here's the problem with gossip. What if Bob and Carol both have a message to send out? How should we do this? Should we make Bob go first and wait until everybody has it and then let Carol? We have problems. First, how do you know when everybody has it? Second, how do we decide who goes first? Third, how do we enforce that? That's complicated. Here's something slightly simpler. Don't worry about it. Let them both pick someone at random at the same time. And then they both pick someone at random at the same time. And they go, and they go, and they go, and exponentially fast goes out. Everybody gets the messages as fast as possible. This is gossip where we just have no control at all over the order. Beautiful. This is as resilient and fast as you can imagine. There are tweaks you can do, but it's already basically the best known thing in computer science, and it's been used for decades, and every DLT uses it for at least part of their protocol. The problem is that the order here and the order here are different. Look at that. Green, blue, red. Blue, green, red. Because, of course, everybody receives the messages in a different order. So every DLT first does this, and then does the hard part, in some sense, of deciding what the order should be. Or proof of work does it slightly differently, but it's essentially like that. I mean, it's equivalent in some sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this so that I add a tiny bit of information to each message, a constant amount, and then once we all have all the messages, we do zero communication at all. Alice just looking at what she has from these messages with a few more bits on each one, constant number, and Bob looks at these with just that, and they both magically know the order. They know the consensus order. That's what we're going to do. Now, of course, there's a whole stream of messages coming out, and you won't know the consensus order on the first three until you get a few more. And then you won't know the consensus order on those until you get a few more after that. But we're going to be doing virtual voting where we don't have to do a lot of real voting, real communication. So here's what we're going to do. What I just showed you was a picture. Here's the history. I said that Alice started with a red message and she sent it to Dave. And then Dave sent it to Bob and Alice sent it to Gina. And then it went like that. That was the history. And then I told you there was a green and a blue one. And the green was spread out like that and the blue spread out like that. This is a way that you could draw a history of how we all talk to each other. This picture is circles connected by lines. That's called a graph, like in graph theory. This is a graph of the history of how we talked. Time is going uphill. If you had a picture like this, you would learn a lot about how information flowed through the network. I mean, you'd see everything. Like you could figure out these red circles colored in are the first time each of these person heard about the red message. The blue colored in circles are the first time they heard about the blue message. So you could say Bob first heard about red at this point in time, first learned about green, first learned about blue. This is the first time that Dave learned about green or blue, and it was simultaneous. He learned about both at the same time, and so on. So what we have here is a history of the gossip, and you can tell how messages spread out and when each person heard about each message for the first time. If all we did was added a timestamp in each of these circles, you would be able to read off the time that everybody received it. You could take all those times that everyone received the red one, let's say blue and green. You could take the time that everybody received the green one, put the times in order, sort them, take the middle one on the list. That's the middle time when everybody received it. That median time could be the official timestamp of it, and we could sort them by official timestamp. That would give us an ordering. So to say that again, we could look at the true time of when you reached the community as being the median time when you reached everybody. If we could just look at that graph, if somehow we could see that graph, we would be able to say that and take the median of those times and say that's the official timestamp on that message and then sort them by the messages. And that would give us fairness in a very deep sense that I'm not really going to talk about. But it is a way of reaching a consensus as well. If we all see that graph, then we all come to the same answer. Cool. What if what?
But what if two medians coincide?
What if two medians coincide? Then we can break ties by taking something like their signatures on those two events. Good question. And then you can even do something like whitening the signature by taking the XOR of all the signatures in one round. And that would even make it hard for the person creating the signature to guess and get a lexicographically low signature if they wanted. So signatures are unpredictable, and if we whiten them, then even the person creating it is unpredictable what the whitened one will be, and we can use that for tie breaking. For a very fundamental reason, though, we're going to find ties to be exceedingly rare. It will become incredibly hard. We can compare not just medians, but extended medians. For this message, I take the middle one on the list. For this message, I take the middle on the list, and I use that to sort them. If it's a tie, I take the one just above the middle and the one just above the middle. If it's still a tie, I take the one below the middle and the one below. And if that's still a tie, I go the one above those and the one above those, and I alternate. So they'd have to have the entire list being the same before they even have a tie in the extended median. And then we could break it by whitened signature. Good question. So we can do all that. But the truth is, we're never going to have ties. That's the short answer. But yes, we could do that. So Hashgraph is gossip. We talked about that. You tell two friends, who tell two friends, who tell two friends, and everybody knows it. It is gossip about gossip. Here's the weird idea. That graph I showed you is sort of a bird's eye view of how we all talk to each other. But if, when I talk to you, I give you a message that contains the transactions, contains a timestamp, and also contains two cryptographic hashes. The hash of the last message I created and the hash of the last message I received. In other words, every time I gossip with you, I not only give you this message that contains some transactions, it also has a timestamp and two hashes. The message itself becomes one of these circles in the graph. And these two lines that come down from it are represented by the hashes, which tell you which two circles these are. Which means I'm not just gossiping about the transactions, I'm gossiping about the gossip itself. It's very recursive. We are gossiping about gossip. And the result of gossiping about gossip is that once you have a pile of messages in memory, because of those two hashes, they connect up and form a graph in memory. And it is the graph of the history of how we all talk to each other. And so almost for free, at the cost of just two hashes and a timestamp, you get a complete history of how the information flowed through the network. And so you know how to find the median, you know how to find consensus. You can do consensus purely in your head. We're done. And so we will do virtual voting. We'll run that voting algorithm, but we'll do it virtually, just by looking at this history graph in memory without talking to anyone. I just say, well, I know everything about how information spread to you. I know what you know and when you knew it. So I know exactly how you would have voted in that voting algorithm. No need to send me the votes. I'll just pretend you did it. It's virtual voting. Even better, you can't lie to me because the virtual you in my head doesn't lie.
Maybe not everyone is familiar with the hash, so you might want to briefly...
I apologize. A hash. Boy, I apologize. You are right. I tried very hard not to make that mistake. I made that mistake. I told you that it's a hash of the last message you sent to the last one there. If you have a file, there's a way in cryptography to scramble it up and crunch it down to just 48 bytes. That's like a fingerprint of that file. And so I don't have to give you the file. I can just give you the fingerprint. You'll know which file I meant. Not only that, no one on Earth knows how to find two files that have the same fingerprint. Nobody knows how to create two files that have the same hash. Now, obviously, if the files are bigger than 48 bytes, they must exist. Just a pigeonhole argument. If two files are bigger than 48 bytes, if the files are bigger than 48 bytes, there must be two that hash down to the same 48 bytes. But no one on Earth knows how to do it. It's a cryptographic hash. We even have cryptographic hashes that we believe are immune to quantum computers, like SHA-2 384, not SHA-2 256. Those are just names of hashes. Most ledgers use the one that's good enough for current computers. We actually use the one that's good enough for quantum computers. So we believe that these fingerprints, the world's cryptographers believe that these fingerprints are going to be unique and unforgeable. And since you've digitally signed the whole thing, that makes the whole thing unforgeable and unchangeable. Given all that, you get the hash graph. It allows you to do the algorithm. I have slightly glossed over what happens if you and I have slightly different hash graphs. Excuse me. It's not a huge deal. The next time we sync, our hash graphs get back in sync again. So it's pretty not a big deal. But just as this one corner case, we have to make sure that we do things right. And that corner case is where all the Byzantine part comes from. We actually vote on who was active at any given moment. That's the real question. At any given moment in time, we're only going to collect votes from the computers that were active. We have to decide who was active, and that's where we do all the Byzantine voting. We usually start with initial votes that are all unanimous anyway. We reach consensus incredibly fast. In experiments, it's just almost always in 2 rounds. And the rounds are really short. They're just twice the log of the number of nodes. So everything is really, really fast. And to make it not be fast would be hard. But that's where all that Byzantine stuff comes from. And that's it. That's the Hashgraph consensus algorithm and the end of the slide presentation. And I think, yes, I think the goal was to end at 12:15 so that we could have questions until 12:30.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect.
Very good.
We're 2 minutes early, and we started 1 minute late. So we've got lots of time for questions. And I think we're also going to go to lunch, and people can join for that if they'd like.
Thank you for a really good talk as well.
Great. So I am happy to answer questions about Hashgraph, or about ABFT in general, or even about those open math questions, although I'm really here to get you interested in Hashgraph and ABFT. But if you're interested in those other math questions, they're really cool too. Or about my background, whatever you're interested in, life in general.
How do you know how many people are in the network?
Good question. So this will work well for hundreds or thousands of nodes. You could theoretically use this for 10 million nodes if you wanted to, but it turns out you can get a lot of advantages if you take your 10 million nodes and break them up into clusters and let each cluster work on different transactions. You get more efficiency. It's called sharding. And so in real-world ledgers, what you want is each ledger needs to be big enough that you can trust it, meaning you can trust that more than 2/3 are honest. So somewhere between 100 and 1,000 random people on the internet, if you do proof of stake, where they have to put up coins, you can trust. And so if I get more than 1,000, I'll just go to more shards and be even faster. But the algorithm will work. The time for the algorithm for communicating around or whatever is logarithmic in the number of nodes. So 8 billion nodes isn't so bad. It just takes log of 8 billion, which is what, 33 syncs. And if we sync 10 times a second, then that's 3.3 seconds. So basically, when you put out a message, it'll go to all 8 billion nodes in 3.3 seconds if you're doing 10 a second. That's not bad. Yes?
What happens if someone starts lying about the 2 hashes?
So, the question is, what would the lie be? When you create this one at the top, you have to put in a hash of this one and this one. Now, if you just make up random hashes, when you someday sync with me and hand it to me, I won't accept it. I won't accept it unless I already have in memory the 2 things that you are referencing with those hashes, which is kind of cool. It means that we can actually compress the hash down to only a few bytes, because you don't have to tell me the whole 48 bytes. You just tell me enough that it matches something uniquely that I have in memory right now.
What if I swap them over?
Aha! So, if you instead give me a hash for this darker line means I claim it's from myself. This lighter line means it comes from someone else. So if I swap these 2, you also will not accept my thing.
Okay.
Here's another attack. I'm sorry?
If I give you an earlier one.
Yeah. If you give me an earlier one instead of him, the other parent, if you give me one way down here, that's fine. You're just not going to have very much influence on the consensus with your event. You're just not helping the community very much, but it's fine. On the other hand, what if, when you create this one, you tell me that your self-parent is this one 2 ago? And when you created this one, you said its self-parent was this one. See, you're supposed to have just a single line of the ones you create yourself. But what I just described is where your single line becomes a Y shape. That is the central way of cheating in a system like this. To be ABFT, you have to mathematically prove that such cheating doesn't get away with it. And to a first approximation, all of our effort is in that. That's the hard part. The strongly seen lemma, the thing that talks about counting a vote only if you get 2/3 of the people on the vote. The equivalent of that for here is what handles the forking.
Okay.
Yeah. And that is the key difficult thing, is to make sure it can handle that. And once you've got that, you're set.
Why is that so malicious? Why is that so dangerous?
Yeah, because in some sense, my virtual voting for you is I think of what your vote was in this round and then how you changed your vote in this round and how you changed your vote in this round. And I come to a conclusion on what vote you had in round 100. But if you form a Y and I only know about one half of that Y and you only know about the other half of that Y, I might think you were voting a certain way around 100. You might think you were voting a separate way in round 100. How do we stop that? That's just like Alice sending different votes to different people. Well, the way we stop it is we look higher in the graph and see if lots of honest people saw this one and not that one. And if I have an honest person, guaranteed I have all their ancestors. And so I'll have both sides of the Y. I know I'm not missing anything. Okay. And so it ends up being very similar arguments to the theorems we just went through. Slightly different because it's on a graph, not on collecting on rounds, but it's very similar. And that's how we deal with those Y shapes.
What's the complexity of keeping track of what people would have voted at different points in time?
The complexity of keeping track of this graph is just order 1. Each transaction takes a constant number of bytes. The calculation of what round number a given event is in, that calculation is order n squared per circle, but it's a very, very fast calculation. And then the voting is extremely fast. All it is I have in memory for any given node, I can know what its votes are that it collected from other people, and I just have to look through the other people. So just order n to calculate the votes on the other people. Very, very fast. And I don't have to do it for every node. I only have to do it for one node out of each round. So you could imagine, say, 1 in 20 nodes if we have lots of people. If we have lots of people, you might imagine 1 in 20 rounds. So I don't even have to do that for all the nodes. So that's how the complexity works out, which is a really nice thing here. What we generally find is that that's not the long pole in the tent. The long pole in the tent is I have to check all those signatures, or I have to gossip everything in the bandwidth, or I have to run Solidity smart contracts. All that, it becomes the slowdown, rather than the consensus itself.
When do you actually do when do people do the balance check, and what's the complexity of that?
So here's the way it works. If I'm a node and somebody gives me a transaction and says, please send this into the network for me, then the very next time I create one of these circles, we call them events, because they are an event recording that someone synced with me. So maybe I sync with you, and then I record the fact that we just synced by creating an event. Its self-parent is the last one I created. Its other parent is the last one that I received from you. When I create the event, I put inside of it the transactions. I put in the transaction that I received from the internet that asked me to submit it. So maybe this circle right here now has your transaction. It will get gossiped out. The graph will continue to grow. And at some point, the graph will be high enough that I know the consensus order on that event. And if you run the program, you can download the program and run it. What you see is that you have all these blue circles and then a little thin strip of green circles at the top that we don't yet know the consensus on. And then as it builds up, they quickly get consensus. Once I know the consensus on this one, I know where it fits in the history of events. I've now put all events in history in a certain order. I take the transactions in those events and I process them in that order. And so I am constantly processing these events, these transactions. And if a transaction says, move money from this account to this account, I do it. I decrement this account and I increment that account. Unless this one didn't have enough, or unless the signature was bad, or unless something else was wrong, in which case I declare it to be a failed transaction and I don't change any balances at all. But I either do it or I don't do it at that moment, and then I'm free to throw it away. I don't have to keep the transaction.
Does the event stay in the graph?
I'm free to throw away everything in the graph down at the bottom once I have done consensus on the ones in the middle. And you could ask questions about, is there a way to throw away things in a way that you're sure will never break your theorems? And the answer is, why, yes, there is. It's non-trivial. It's an additional set of proofs, and we have proven those, and we have gotten COQ to check those as well. I keep talking about COQ. It is possible to have a computer check a math proof. It is somewhere between 10 times harder and 1,000 times harder to write a math proof that the computer can check than to just write it on paper, like for a math journal. And Carl Crary at Carnegie Mellon is an amazing professor there. He has actually done COQ proofs now for even that. So now we can know that we can, do this incremental algorithm that will actually be correct. So there's stuff that we do like that. Carnegie Mellon's fun. That's where I got my PhD. It was in machine learning in 1999, 20 years ago. And it's a fun place. And so he's working on those COQ proofs. But yes, the answer is, once we have consensus and we've processed it, we can throw away the event itself. So we don't keep an infinite graph in memory. We just keep a very tiny graph. Now to make the gossip work, I'll actually keep several minutes worth of graph. Basically, everything I've received in the last few minutes, I'll keep those, just so that if somebody's struggling to catch up, when they sync with me, I'll have really old stuff that I can give them to help them catch up. But there's no necessity for that. I only have to keep a few rounds at any given time. But I actually keep it several minutes just to help make the gossip work better.
Slightly weird question. What do you find people tend to value a computer-aided proof more than a maths proof? Is that why you do them at the minute? Or?
It's an interesting question. So I do not think the mathematical community has that philosophy, although I'll give you a case where maybe that philosophy is true.
Yeah.
The four-color map theorem was proved twice with computers. Yeah. You're familiar with the two different proofs. Yeah. There were legitimate concerns about the first one.
Right.
And the second one is, in a very real sense, more believable.
Right.
And just for those who aren't familiar, the four-color math theorem was first proved by a mathematician mathematically saying, here's how to generate a set of little graphs that you have to test a certain property about. Then, it was too big of a set to check by hand. They had a computer check all of those cases. The computer program found all those cases worked, and therefore, because of the theorem they had proved with English, they could conclude, yes, the four-color map theorem is true. You can color any planar map with four colors. That's sufficient. However, how do you check that? If you're doing peer review for a math journal, how do you check such a thing? Well, you read through the English, and then you read through the source code of the program, and you say, I think that program would do a good job of checking. And then you run that program on your computer and say, okay, it did output a yes. I guess I believe it. So there was debate in the math community. Is that a proof or not? And to this day, nobody's come out with a purely handwritten proof of the four-color math theorem. What was later proved, and I think actually this one was COQ, same system. But what was later proved is they did a proof that could be checked by a computer. And they did actually use a big computer program and did a lot of manual work in order to generate this computer checkable proof. Computer checkable proofs are not all that readable, especially the fine-grained details of it. But once they had the computer checkable proof, it could be checked by a really tiny program. And it's a really tiny program that's been around for decades, that's been checking lots of proofs for decades. So maybe I actually trust that little tiny program that's been widely used all over the place and is very simple, did a good job of checking the proof. And I think I believe that a lot more than those bespoke programs that were written just for the four-color problem were correct. So I kind of like the idea of COQ proofs. That is a case where maybe COQ made the mathematical community happier. In the other cases, I don't think it made them happier at all, for obvious reasons. Yes, we've proved in Gödel's incompleteness theorem and the halting problem. Well, okay, we all believe those anyway. Right? You can check it by hand. They proved Kepler's conjecture. Maybe that even goes into the area where I have a slightly better belief. If you stack oranges, the most efficient way to do it is the way grocery stores always stack oranges. Obvious. That was proved. The proof is the size of a book, and it involves complicated things. That was recently proved, not by COQ. I think I forgot which one they used. HOL maybe? I forgot which one it was. I think it wasn't COQ. Maybe it was COQ. Anyway, the Kepler conjecture was proved. Maybe it makes me happier. If somebody ever does it for Fermat's last theorem, I might be a lot happier because that's a really big, dense proof that's a whole book. So maybe it helps a little bit. But that is not why I am interested in COQ proofs. Here's why I am interested in COQ proofs. I want to prove that the computer program implementing it is correct. Now history shows programs have bugs. All programs have bugs. Fixing a bug will always create two bugs. It's a theorem of computer science. There are protocols. They aren't even programs, just protocols. I'll send you this information, you send me this information, that have had bugs for decades that weren't found until they tried to check it by computer. Much less the code underneath it. There was a sort routine, just sorting arrays, that was in multiple computer languages. It was the standard sort routine in the language. I think Perl used it. Other languages used it as the standard that had a bug in it. that wasn't found until they tried to check it with a computer. That's what I'm really interested in, because there I think it has a huge practical implication.
Yeah.
However, the only way you can do it is to have the computer check that the algorithm you implemented exactly matches a description of the algorithm. Well, how do you know your description of the algorithm is correct and doesn't have bugs? For that, the only way to do it is to prove the theorem with COQ or some other system. And so what we have done is we have started by proving the theorem in COQ, which as a side effect means we have now written up the theorem in a way that COQ understands, which means we have written up the algorithm in a way that the theorem understands. And now we're going to go down one of the other two paths that are common. We'll write some Java code and prove that it matches, or we'll push a button and have it spit out code, which it can also do. Proof by construction or proof by proof, either way, we'll have a correctness proof of the code. And that is the ultimate goal. And in computer science, there is work being done on proving that programs are correct, like Java programs, and then proving that the interpreter and runtime system, the JVM, is correct, and then proving that the compiler that built all that is correct, and proving that the operating system is correct, and then proving that the chip that it's running on is correct. And you prove the whole stack, and then you actually have a great deal more trust. Although there are false theorems proven in math journals, I'm not worried about that. It doesn't happen all that often. But bugs in code, I'm a lot worried about. Bugs in code are a serious problem in a practical sense. And I think the only solution in the world of computer scientists is for computer scientists to turn into mathematicians and to be able to do that. I was a computer science professor. I don't know if I mentioned that, but I like math. So I'm not a mathematician, I just pretend to be one. But I'm a computer science professor that has always done mostly math stuff. So that's a really good question about the COQ. What does it mean to prove it in the computer? Well, maybe in some sense it doesn't mean anything, but in other senses it means everything. Very different senses.
What do you envisage sitting on top of the hash graph? So you mentioned the cryptocurrency. What else would sit on top?
Oh, great question. So cryptocurrencies are useless by themselves. Some people disagree, they're wrong. You need other stuff. So what we have right now, if you have the cryptocurrency, we also have a file storage system, and we also have smart contracts, which means you can run little programs on top of it, arbitrary little programs. Kind of cool. File system means we can do revocation services. Like you could take a hash of your driver's license. In this country, it is called... Good name! Wow! That is so good. As you're aware, Americans often get names wrong, and I was just trying to give you the right name. So, you could put a hash of your driver's license in the ledger in such a way that anytime you want to, you can take it back out, and so can the government authority that gave you that driver's license, which I'm pretty sure is not called the Department of Motor Vehicles. It's actually called the DDA?
DVLA.
DVLA. So the DVLA could remove this. Like you get in trouble, like a DUI, you drive drunk or something, or I don't know what gets you in trouble, and they take away your driver's license. The DVLA then could remove it from the ledger. And so the ledger is a proof that your driver's license is still not revoked, that it is still valid. It is a revocation service that lets them revoke it. So that's why you might want to store files. Also, you have a guarantee that the whole world sees your file and they see the same file. So there's a company we've talked to that wants to keep their records, their financial records, in a way that's public to the world. And they could email it to everybody, but maybe they email different ones to different people. If you put it as a file or a hash of it as a file in Hashgraph, in our ledger, then you can know, everyone in the world can know that they're seeing the same set of books. You're not cooking the books and having two sets of books. You can use the same principle for records, the record of the history of pharmaceuticals to make sure it didn't go through some pretty shady stops along the way, or the history of a diamond to make sure it isn't a conflict diamond, a blood diamond, or a history of food so you know actually where it came from. And was it truly organic, or does it just say organic without being truly organic? These are sorts of things you can record. Or you could record, especially using these smart contracts, things like real estate deeds. Who owns a house? In America anyway, it costs thousands of dollars and it takes weeks to do a title search to see who owns the house I'm about to buy. That's insane. You should put it in a computer and have a computer know. Well, people are doing that with these ledgers and then no one can lie about it. People are using it for things like markets, stock markets and games and other things where people are interacting with each other. And you can interact with strangers and have the little program running on the ledger guarantee that the right thing happens. I can guarantee that I'm going to give you some digital property and you're going to give me some digital money, and that either we both get what we want or neither. And there's no way you can rip me off. Even if I'm malicious, I can't steal from you, because we all trust the smart contract to be run correctly, because it's run by every single computer in the network, and as long as more than 2/3 are honest, guaranteed it works. These are just scratching the surface of what ledgers can do. This is something that has had huge hype and no reality for a while. And I was just talking recently to someone in the financial community. It appears that 2020 is the year when, to a real degree, these ledgers actually start doing real things. DLT actually starts being used for real things. I think in 2020 is the year.